Okay, everybody, I think we've settled the room out here. So welcome. For those I don't know, my name is Grant Walters. I'm the Director of Ed Programs here at Hawaii Central Office. And today we are having a information/feedback session on the Housing and Residence Life Programs revisions to the CAS standards. Alan Blattner and I, who is going to be your presenter today, both sit on the CAS Council. So we've been privy to lots of this activity going on, not just for housing and residence life, but for other areas of student affairs as well. And Alan's going to share housing and residence life plus some other things. We're going to be really informal this morning. Alan's going to share some information, leave some time open for questions, and hopefully solicit some feedback from you all that'll be important in shaping some of those documents coming up. Through email, we sent you really recently, and I apologize I didn't get it out sooner, the draft of the document. I will put that in the chat in just a second, just in case you didn't get that over email, but you're welcome to leaf through that and share it as you see fit. This session will be recorded, so if you'd like to see it later or if you'd like to pass it along to other folks, we'll have a link ready for you in probably about 24 or 48 hours or so. And there's also a session this afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern that folks can attend. If you need or would like to use the live transcript function, at the very bottom, there's a live transcript button. You can click on that and show subtitle, and that should pull up the captions as they come up. All right, well, without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to Alan, and thanks.
All right, thanks, Grant, and welcome, everybody. Thanks for getting up early and starting your day, if at least you're in the eastern part of the U.S., with a rousing discussion about CAS standards. As Grant said, I, for the past 2 years, have had the good fortune of being able to be a CUHY's one of CUHY's representatives to the CAS Council, to the board. And one of our roles every year is to participate in the review of whatever standards are up for review. And Grant and I got lucky that during our tenure on the board, the CUHY standards are up for review. So we're very excited to talk with you a little bit about, I'm going to share a little bit of information about the process and kind of where we are. But the meat of this session, I hope, is us going through what is now the current and near final draft. This session is intentionally placed toward the end of the review, and I'll show you where the document has been to get it to this point. But we're really looking for final feedback before we take this thing for approval in November. So I'm going to share some slides here just for context. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, terrific. We'll talk a little bit about CAS, a little bit about the process, a little bit about the standards, because when you look at the document, you need kind of a quick tutorial to be able to understand exactly what it means and what the colors mean and all those kind of things. So we'll go through all that. And then again, I really want the lion's share of today to be a review of the current draft. And so that's kind of our plan for today. Again, I really appreciate everybody being here. To start, CAS is a group of now 41 member organizations founded in 1979. CUHY was one of the 7 founding members of CAS, got together and decided that there needed to be standards for the student affairs profession. And so started this organization and has built it into to what it is today. All the representative associations have members on the council, really a consensus collaborative approach to setting standards for all of student affairs. So there are 47 functional area standards, and with every functional area standard would be housing and residence life. That's a functional area within student affairs. And then there's a self-assessment guide. The self-assessment guide is used by campuses to go through a process on your campus where you determine where you fall in relationship to the CAS standard. Do you meet the standard? Do you exceed the standard? Is it one that you're still aspiring to achieve? Also used by external reviewers if they were to come to your campus and help you navigate that process. There are also 3 and growing number of cross-functional frameworks These are for things that don't neatly fall into any one area of student affairs. So for example, the first year experience that is owned by many groups on campus. We developed cross-functional frameworks in order to talk about those. So that's a little bit about CAS. Here are the functional areas that have been where there are standards. And you can see housing residential programs as one of many. So in cycle, each of these is reviewed on about an every 7 or 8 year cycle. Each of the standards has 12 pieces to it, and this is for consistency. Every standard has each one of these areas covered within it. And so you'll see in the document that there's numbers 1 through 12, and then from there, all the things that pertain to housing and residence life. This revision was made in 2018. If you look at anything before 2018, you will see a very different look and feel to the standards. All the standards were modernized in 2018 to fit this framework. So a little bit about the process that we've been through in order to get you the draft that you were sent this morning. So last time our standard was updated was in 2013. And as I mentioned, in 2018, all of the standards were updated across all functional areas. When we talk about the standards that are across, so there's a canon of standards that exists in all 47 of these documents. And those are unchangeable by the review committees that I currently sit on and that our experts from our association participate in. Those are changed about every 8 years, and they're actually under review right now. And so if, for example, our group that has recently participated in reviewing the housing standards wants a change to one of those standards, you put in what's called the Bank of CAS, and you essentially bring that forward to CAS and say, we really think there needs to be a modernization of this standard. It's not changed instantaneously, it's changed every 8 years when they go ahead and review the general standards. And so that'll make a whole lot more sense when we dive into the document. But there are some things within this process that are not up for debate at this moment, but we just happen to be at a fortunate point within the CAS cycle of things where the general standards are also being reviewed and will be released next year. One of the important charges we gave to everybody who's been involved in this process is not only is this an opportunity to reflect back at the past 8 years since the standards were last examined, but we really needed to challenge ourselves to look forward 8 years, because we really need these standards to last the test of time for us. And so, you know, not just what's current today, but really to start to think about emerging trends, things that may impact us as we go forward. For example, you know, if we were to go back 7 years, you know, there were lots of standards about, you know, thou shalt provide telephones. Well, a lot has changed in the past 8 years, and not many of us are providing telephones anymore. So we need to kind of modernize that standard, but then also looking forward, what are those elements in the next 7 or 8 years that we want to try to the best of our ability to get out in front of. I also wanted to quickly just mention that we are one of, I think it's 4 associations that, in addition to having a CAS standard, also has their own internal standards. So we have our own ACUHO-I standards. And there's a pretty good reason for that. First of all, I believe that the ACUHO-I standards were first. As one of the founding members of CAS, we came into it with our own standards. We realized as an association that the power of standards and what they gave to our profession, and really thought that would be good kind of across the board. But also, the ACUHO-I standards are much broader than the Housing and Residence Life CAS standard. And you see on the screen now, obviously our Housing and Residence Life CAS standard needs to focus on just the business of providing housing and residential life, residential programs. But our work on many campuses umbrellas things that are also found in other standards. And those are the other items listed in red. conference and event services. A lot of our housing programs manage those for the campus, but that's not true on every campus. So it's a separate standard, not embedded in the housing and residential life programs. Same with dining. On many campuses, those two are linked, but not on all. So CAS really has divided the work of establishing its standards based on large functional area. The ACUA standards, if you read them, umbrella all of those things together into one document. And so that's really the major difference between the two of those. And just for reference, the ACUA standards are also being reviewed right now by some of our colleagues from across the globe. So that's really why we have, if you've ever wondered why we have both sets of standards, that's kind of the method behind the madness there. Talk about the structure of the review that has gone on. For every standard that gets reviewed, there is a committee of CAS members that is put together. The executive board appoints a chair. They appointed Ray Plaza. Those of you may know Ray. He currently works in diversity and equity work, but he had a long career in collegiate housing at Virginia Tech, University of Florida, and other places. He's the ACPA representative to CAS, and they tapped him to serve as chair, and he's done a phenomenal job. Then there are a functional area expert, and that's typically the association rep, and so that's been me. Then there's within CAS something called the Standards Management Committee, and their role is to try and assure consistency across all of the standards as they are reviewed, that we don't have a group that takes the standards too far afield or to make sure that they meet the standards of CAS. So there's always at least one representative from that committee on each of the review committees, and then other members get to sign up. For example, I've been a part of the work for the student conduct process when it was going on. I jumped on that one. Other members of the board have jumped onto our internal CAS review committee. Then, with the help of grants and ACUA, we solicited a committee of internal experts. And these are us. These are members of ACUA selected through an open call. And also we did a little bit of shoulder tapping there of some key members of our already established committee network. For example, the chair of the ACUA standards, maybe they ought to be involved in the redo of the CAS standards. Those kinds of natural linkages. It was really important to ACUA that we reflect some of the work the association has done in the DE&I space. So some of the members of that work group that was put together were tapped to come on to the review, so they could add that lens to the work we were doing. They have really provided valuable insight and perspective. They're selected from a diverse group of institutions, and for their diverse perspectives. We've got small colleges, we've got one international person, we've got people from HBCUs and one tribal college. I mean, they really came from a wide variety of institutions. And so we were thrilled with the diversity in that group. And their job is really to help us make sure these that initial goal I said of that we not only reflect the changes that have happened in the past 8 years, but help foreshadow what might be coming in the next 8 years and write standards that will help us address that. And so it's been a really critical and amazing process, and they have served us incredibly well. So this is the timeline of things, of kind of where we've been, and we are right on track. So we are now in the September, October here, where we're soliciting feedback, and we're prepared on September 30th. We will take this draft to the entire CAS board for a final review. If they have recommended changes, we will make those. That's when the feedback from this session will be incorporated. And that will drive to the November board meeting, where the standard will be up for a vote as to whether or not it becomes the new standard for the association and for CAS. So we are right on track, having included lots of voices. We did a session similar to this at ACE. The experts have been engaged all the way through. We similarly engaged ACPA, used to be called Commission 3. I think it's now called Residential Programs. I'm not exactly sure how they're titling that, but leadership from that group. We really tried to cast the net widely in terms of who wanted to look at these standards and who could help them be as good as they can. And so the goal then is in late 2021 or early 2022, the new document is available through CAS for people to begin using. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions about kind of the table set. Awesome. All right. And please, we're a small enough group, just unmute and kind of jump in. I should have mentioned that earlier. All right. So I talked about kind of there's kind of a quirky way the CAS standards are written. And I want to make sure before we dive into the document that we understand that. There are standards and guidelines. Standards are the indispensable requirements. They're what this process has unveiled as things that every housing residence-like program should have. They appear in bold, and you'll see they use the words must or shall. Guidelines, on the other hand, are there to clarify or to give examples. They're enhanced practice beyond the essential function. They're not in bold, and they use should or may. And so normally there is a standard, and then it is clarified by a guideline. And that's only if the standard needs clarification. Sometimes, for example, the standard that all programs must have mission statements really doesn't need any clarification. You're pretty clear on what we should do with that. But something that has a little bit more nuance to it, there's very often some guidelines. But because the guidelines get more specific, that means they may not apply to every campus. So we don't want to force people into things that don't pertain. Because again, these are international in scope. They have to represent all of the different types of institutions that are represented with that have collegiate housing. So small colleges to large publics, well-funded to the struggling, old buildings, new buildings. I mean, it's really gotta capture and speak to all of those. So we have to be very careful when we write these that we're not too prescriptive with things that are essentially unattainable across the board. So those are the basics for that. And when you get into the document, you'll see in the general standards, they are written in the blue. So, and then the standards so those are unchangeable, as I mentioned before. If we had changes for there, I would take that note and I would recommend it to the Bank of CAS, which is the general standard review that goes on every 8 years. We have made lots of suggestions to the Bank of CAS through this process, and expect to see some of that come through their review. But when we're looking today, we're going to be looking for the bold stuff in black, which is exactly the things that the committee has been spending its time kind of diving into. So these are the different kinds of standards. And then similarly, there are different guidelines. So the guidelines appear in black and are changeable. And those are also things that through this review and the review we've had over the past 18 months have been guided by the experts and by the committees. So what does that look like in the actual document? You can see here that the HRL must develop and define its mission. Bold and blue, can't touch that one. But the one down below it, where HRL must apply to residence halls, apartment communities, and other facilities managed, owned, operated by private operators, that is one that was written by the committee that we could go ahead and edit. So stuff in blue, we can only recommend. Stuff in black, we can go ahead and prescribe change. So with that as kind of the backdrop, and I know you just got the document, I'm prepared to kind of take us through some of the areas where the committee feels like we have made some substantial changes for feedback. But But I guess I wanted to start with, if anybody has either a question about whether something is in the standards, whether or not, if you've had a chance to review them, if you read something that you wanted to start by talking about. So we can start there with kind of popcorning around any questions and things you all have. If not, what we'll do is there are a couple of key questions we have interest in more feedback on. So let me start by, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see the group. Are there thoughts people have initially about the standards that you've had a chance to take a peek at, or questions about whether something's in there?
Alan, I have a question. I'm not totally sure this is the exact right time, but I wanted to ask it before I forget it. Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Tankerslam from Kent State University. We have recently, in our housing department, gone through a little bit of a shift where we are now combined with our dining operation. So I guess my question is, knowing that we have kind of the residence life standards and the dining standards, I guess, is there any suggestions on, I guess, using them in unison, or kind of, obviously they're still separate guideline or standards.
Sure.
But I'm trying to think through this kind of joint department we now have.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Kind of what that might look like.
From the CAS perspective, they're separate from the ACUHO-I standards. They're embedded together, and so that may be a good reason to lean on the ACUHO-I standards versus the CAS standards. From a review perspective, and from it's a huge bite to take off reviewing both of those, and so I think people very often use the fact that there are separate CAS standards to say, let's put them on a different cycle for review. Just because, and also if you were to engage external review experts, sometimes it's hard to find people that can really speak to both of those camps. So sometimes people keep them separate from the review of standards process, but obviously from an operational standpoint, you need to integrate them, you need to bring them together. And so there's some, that would make me lean towards looking at the ACUHO-I standards, because they are more deeply embedded in there. Although if you were to take and line up the the CAS housing standard and the CAS dining standard, you would see cross-pollination in them. For example, several places in the housing standard, we do still speak to dining facilities. And what we tried to do in this review is change that language around to say facilities that impact the residential experience. And that lets you kind of take it and does that include dining on your campus? On some campuses, that includes conference facilities. And so we tried to broaden what the standards could speak to in that way. I don't know if that helps at all, but.
No, it does. I mean, it's still a new thing for us.
Yeah.
I don't know, a couple months into it. So we're not going to do any review at the moment. But,
yeah, that's right. I know there's a great network of, because there's, it's few and far between now that the programs are joined. A lot have been separated. So especially in the Big Ten, you've got lots of colleagues who wear both hats. So that may be a really good network.
Cool. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the standards, are there particular questions people have? If not, we'll start with the old program and services number 2, which is where we probably made the lion's share of our changes.
Alan, I do have one quick question, and
Sure.
I apologize if I missed it in your presentation. In the document, what does the pink refer to? There's it's on page, there's no page number. Hold on a second. It's under 2.1. It's like it's right above actually 2.3. There's a sentence there, or a couple sentences.
That's actually specifically highlighted for this conversation. Okay. And that's one of the places I'm going to be going if you all don't have questions. That will eventually be black. But it's one that we've had lots of discussions around, and we know it is top of mind for lots of people. Was really underrepresented in the previous versions of the standards, and so we want to make sure we get this right. So it's highlighted in pink because I want this group to talk about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any initial questions? All right, as if on cue, we'll go to the section in pink. This is embedded in section 2, which is programs and services. And it is the most all-encompassing standard within the 12 standards, or I guess section within the 12 standards, because it really, by design, is to describe the programs and services that housing and residence life operations ought to be thinking about offering and providing to their students. And so it is, it's a critically important place. It's one of the first places when I do external reviews that I look, because it gives a lot of guidance to the kinds of things we ought to be thinking about. And so we can talk about anything in this section, but as was mentioned, there's one piece here about our involvement of the police and mental health. And I know a number of campuses are struggling with this on 2 fronts. One, an increase in the amount of mental health work that we're doing in terms of intervention, either by entry-level staff in the halls, by RAs, by having to support those operations. And that many campuses have leaned on law enforcement in that capacity. But now we've got an opportunity nationally to be thinking about the intersection of those two. It's being done on the community level, and it needs to be done on the association and the college housing level. I know we've engaged in these conversations. And so we were looking for how to capture that in a standard, and to make sure that campuses are indeed engaged in that process. So that's where this particular item in pink comes through. And I'd love any thoughts or feedback that people have on either the way this works doesn't go far enough, should be more prescriptive. Thoughts and feelings.
Alan, this is Larry Corral Hughes from Stetson University. My question in this is, how would a campus whose campus security is law enforcement?
Right.
Many campuses, they are sworn law officers. How would they interpret this versus me at Stetson, where we have public safety,
Yep.
which is not sworn officers except our director, and local law enforcement. So for me, it's really clear in the work that I do, that separation.
Yep.
But like when I was at Wake Forest or Baylor or
Yep.
places, I don't know how I would interpret this.
Yeah.
I think for me, what I would add too is that within some states, depending on the law, only certain people can pink slip students, right? And so we find ourselves in that situation in Ohio where the police can pink slip, and I think there's one other group that can. And so that makes it a bit of a challenge for us. So I think the laws within the state impact the ability to do certain things as well.
Yeah. Can you describe what pink slipping is? I'm not sure I'm familiar with
So
that.
let's say, for instance, a student needs to be transported and they refuse to. The police can do that and require them to go, as well as it's another entity that can as well. But that's why we have the police come just in case, as soon as I refuse to go.
Hi, this is Jeanette from Eastern Michigan. So I do work I've worked within SUNY as well as here at Michigan, where we did have full-fledged police officers. First of all, I appreciate this here. I personally don't think the standards always are prescriptive. Like, it may be more thought-provoking, this sentence, to say, hey, you really need to think about what that looks like. But I'm happy to have it here. And given how prescriptive the rest of the document is, like, I'm okay with how it's written. This would just be a piece that I could bring to my police department and say, we want to continue to have this conversation. This is a CAS standard. I don't know, I don't think police are within CAS standards, but maybe I'm wrong.
They are. ICLEA is one of the groups.
Okay.
And, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it at least opens a conversation and puts a mention. I think it's always difficult to decide what that looks like. And certainly I've worked with police enforcement that sometimes work better with my team, and sometimes it was a challenge, and that's just the nature of lots of things. So I'm glad it's here is what I'll say. And I think it should stay for sure as something that we need to keep in our head as our communities are hopefully also thinking through this concept.
Yeah, I mean, first I'd point out it's a should, so it's a guideline. And then we used, and again, through the different iterations, this has been more prescriptive in terms of, it started with a recommendation that law enforcement not be involved in mental health. And we quickly realized, coming out of committee that look at it, my friend from Ohio there, that may not be legally possible in a state. So we pulled out the old CAS trick of evaluate policy and procedure. That's our favorite phrase, because really what that does is, again, if I'm doing a review, I'm going to ask you, how have you evaluated this? And then you're going to bring your own unique context for your campus, whether it's security or full-fledged law enforcement, whether there are laws that guide this. We all are under, mandatory clear reporting, and that has an impact in terms of how campuses have chosen to operationalize that. And so, but Jeanette, very similar to you, but we wanted to force the conversation so that people couldn't say that we had just been through this past 18 months that we've all been through and not given a really hard look to opportunities to make this service better for students, for all students. Any other thoughts on this? Okay. That was the biggie in this section. Are there other, maybe just go ahead, Larry, you raising a hand there? Just chime in.
Yeah, one thing just caught my attention. The modifier on the last phrase, and other non-emergency incidents, mental health, like there are often mental health emergencies that you don't like. So that other non-emergency incidents, reports of sexual violence and sexual harassment, when you say other, that means that sexual violence and harassment, mental health are not emergency situations. So
that's a great point.
Works backwards.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think they mean and non-emergency situation. I mean, I think they're meant to say these are emergencies, but you also need to be thinking about it for non-emergencies. But you're right, that may have a backwards modifying impact that we don't quite mean. That's a great point. Excuse me for a second while I make a note. Okay. Let me ask this question. Are there things you're wondering, are they in the standards that you know is so important to the work that you do, and you would like to see how and to see if the standards are helping us address it? And this will challenge me to be able to remember where everything is in this 27-page document. So so are there particular things you want to talk about in terms of topics that we could focus in on the standards? Again, if not, I can keep going through the areas that we have specific questions about.
The one thing that I was really interested in, I kind of scrolled through and I found it around staff wellness. I think that we've seen a lot of people move out of housing and res life, especially after the pandemic, because of the stress related to it. And,
Yes.
our efforts to care for students is important, but the wellness of staff is important too. And so I think I've heard that loud and clear from my Live On staff, like, I need to move off. I need space. I need to take care of myself. And so I saw it as I scrolled further down, but that's one thing that's been a highlight in the top of my mind as of recently, especially as I see people transition out to promotions mostly, but also signifying wellness as a piece of why they're leaving.
Yeah, that's in the HR section, is it not? Is that where you found it, in HR? Hope you're muted there.
I need to go back and look and
Yeah,
see
you're.
exactly where I saw it, but I scrolled through. I saw it in a couple different spaces.
Yeah, we really try. You know, it's funny. We challenged ourselves to not have this document where you could read it and you would say you knew it was written during a pandemic, because it was very. We were all there. We, like a couple people said, well, do we need to mention isolation and quarantine? It's like, God, I hope not. So. But you broaden that into being prepared for emergency situations. And the same thing there. We knew that people were acutely aware of the mental health of all of our staff, particularly live-in staff and others who were on campus through much of the pandemic. But to make sure we wrote that in a way that was more broadly generalizable to what we hope are more normal conditions. We always ought to be concerned about the mental health of all of our staff. And so how do we appropriately write that? Did you find it again, just so I can get there so we can?
I'll put it in the chat when I find it.
Okay, that's awesome. Another section that I wanted to spend some time on was the equity, access, diversity, inclusion section. We spent a lot of time, Sean Kreiser, if you know Sean, and others really helped us connect it to the work that had been done in the association over the past year, and tried to really inject some things that I think will really hope will, as we review ourselves to these standards, raise the bar a little bit and open some lines of dialogue that haven't otherwise been there, and maybe more directly. I think they've always been in the standards, but I think they're called out more directly in here. In particular, some of the impact of socioeconomics and rate increases. This is another place, Chris, where we do mention dining rates, because they are coupled in the ability for our students to not experience housing and food insecurity. A number of those are embedded in here. Some real calls for better and more thorough staff training and onboarding in terms of remaining current with the conversations that are going on, so that we can continue to serve all of our students well. In particular, a call for addressing more clear for addressing hate and bias incidents and racism with clear, proactive, and our well-articulated policies and procedures. Many institutions have them, many don't. So really trying to help frame what that might look like. And so there's been a lot of work done in this section as well. Again, to really try and not just modernize and not just bring to current, but to really try and foreshadow where we may be headed, where we're hopefully headed, based on current dialogues, and have these standards help push us in that direction. I'm just going to scroll through and let folks kind of read, and if there are things you see. This one here that I'm highlighting, it was a really interesting conversation that we had. I'm not sure it reads quite like, I think it's still a little confusing, but we really wanted to implore organizations to not only look at the formal policies and things that we have, but there's a lot of things baked into culture within institutions that has an impact both on staff and students. So this was our attempt to try and kind of cull that out a little bit. Again, I'm not sure we nailed it here. It's one that will continue to be looked at. Would love any thoughts that people have on that one.
I would just say, there was some way you can move the organizational culture piece earlier in the sentence, because like, as I'm reading through that list, like I've lost where we're going. Like it's not clear where we're going, and to connect all of that to organizational culture, if there was any way to get it earlier in the sentence.
So must invest the organizational culture by questioning the norm, so that you frame it around culture first.
Right.
Yeah, that might make some sense. All right, let me continue to flip here. Again, the blue is the standard. The black is the stuff that our groups have pulled together.
Alan, is there anything in this document that refers to restorative practices with regard to conduct or that sort of thing?
Generally, again, the difference between this and the ACU standards is that we will stay away from a lot of prescriptive stuff in terms of student conduct. That's in the student conduct standards. But I know we incorporated the term restorative justice. I think it's up in the program standards where we talk about linking with student conduct offices in internal practices. I forget where it is, but there's a statement in there about the connection with the conduct office in both conduct restorative justice and community guided discipline or something like that, community guided practice. There are other thoughts people have. I'll just continue to, let me go to the other area we were interested in feedback.
I have a thought, and super prescriptive, which I understand, but I'm going to
you're good.
I'm going to say it anyways, even though it's prescriptive. So I think one of the things that's challenging, Casey, while I'm at WPI in Worcester, Massachusetts. So one of the things that's challenging as a small school is we're being asked to do more and more and more with less and less and less, right? So I think as we look at the standards that are being created, both from the must and also the should, but being able to accomplish all of that and look at all of that when you're operating on a sort of a shoestring staff size, is challenging. And so one of the things I'm often asked about when I push back on leadership about the size of my staff and the ratios of students to staff and all this is like, was there a standard? And I know that it would be very prescriptive to come up with a standard, but I do think it would be helpful for the association to consider maybe saying like, at minimum, it is recommended, blah, 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 or whatever, because I think as we try to implement all of these things, I'm just looking at them and I'm just thinking about how would I even accomplish this when I've got one live-in staff member to 20 plus RAs with 805 residents, like, and you're talking about instances of mental health and culture and diversity of inclusion. Like, so I just am throwing that out there to consider for that purpose.
Yeah, that is an absolute challenge. And I scrolled down to the funding section, you know, where we talk some about that in terms of where are I know it's in here. Maybe it's not in the budget section, but I know we have spoken to that. That was called out by the experts. The other thing that is in here now that wasn't before is a real call to keep housing and residence life operations together where possible. You know, again, not as an absolute standard, but that as a best practice, because, you know, small schools very often have to make this list of things that is in the standard, not just a housing residence life priority, but it has to be a priority of the counseling center or the because if you don't have that support, Casey, you can't do it, because you got a shop of 2 or 3. So in the assessment, there is a piece about assessing the capability and essentially bandwidth of staff in terms of reflecting the ability to meet the standards. And I think it's also it's in the budget section here somewhere, and I'm not finding it right away, but it's absolutely called out, and I'll make sure we highlight that as we go forward.
I appreciate it, and I'll check out that assessment.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Alan, Casey, I appreciate you saying that, because I often feel in the same place. And I have been an advocate for CAS for my entire career, and tried to do a review of our department 3 years ago, and it just made me mad.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah.
All of the musts were overly prescriptive, especially in the programmatic piece. So I like the way a lot of it has been cleaned up. I think if we could go to the collaboration section,
Yeah.
Reading that was helpful for me, but I think it could be nuanced a little bit more to address things that you said, Casey, and some of the things that I feel often.
You'd think I'd know where that. Which number is that?
It's like page 25, I think. Yeah, it's section 8, I think. If you
That's what I
a
thought.
little bit more. Yeah. So, really and truly, on a small campus or even a large campus, almost anything in this document could be with or through campus partners. Like,
Yes.
all of our safety communication, all of our safety could be the responsibility of public safety or another entity. And a lot of the educational pieces, a lot of the outreach, a lot of the support, depending on how your campus is arranged, could be the articulated responsibility of someone else.
Yep.
That we just have to work with. So should there be a fire safety plan that's posted? Yes. Is it our responsibility to post it? Not on my campus.
Right.
Public safety. Should I have so I think if in the collaboration piece, we could make that more prominent and more explicit, that almost anything in here could be the articulated responsibility of another entity on campus, I think could provide a lot of like relief to some campuses, especially smaller campuses, because it may be like, no, we're not doing financial programming. Number one, because I don't believe it's in our mission or our goals or
right.
Number two, we got a financial aid department over there who's experts.
Yeah. It's a really good point. And to think about how CAS will react to that, I think it will be to articulate that, but to also say within this document, it's up to the Housing Residence and Life program to make sure that those things are in place. Is that fair? I mean, even though it's not your responsibility, but you gotta know before you check it off your list that you're fire safety compliant, that someone has taken care of that.
Right.
So the standard for us would be that we have to intentionally know it's taken care of, but articulate that it might not be done by us.
Yeah.
Especially on smaller campuses.
Yeah. Even like the professional development.
Yes.
Or the diversity and inclusion work, like the professional development, maybe you're on a campus that has a really amazing human resources department that does great development work, or has centralized, resources.
Absolutely.
Does that as a division that's not internal, but so I think that could provide a lot of goodwill.
It could provide a lot of appropriate cover, really, that we know this is happening, but I have limited control because it's not us, but I know it's happening and I have influence as much as I can. Yeah, I like it a lot. Casey, would that help you as well? Yeah. Thinking back to my Allegheny days, that would absolutely help.
Yeah, I think it would. And I think it's because I think the thing that's really challenging, at least, and I think others probably feel this too, is that senior leadership thinks that like our field is prescriptive, and it's like, yeah, no two campuses are the same in terms of residence life and housing and what they have to offer and how they go about it, which is why these standards exist. But they're like, well, why doesn't it just say XYZ? And it's like, because it's open to, so I think that would be really helpful to add that in.
Yeah, we could absolutely do that. And then again, I'll make sure that in the budget section that we talk about that other thing. Yeah.
And Casey, one of the things about that is it could also inhibit somebody. Like if that standard is there of like, you must have XYZ coverage, it could inhibit somebody doing something creative like George Washington did with like saying, we're going to up our professional, rearrange what our student staff looks like.
Yep.
But I do think I know exactly what you're saying, because it's the same conversation on my campus as well. But I don't know if that is something that could be even thought of as a should.
Yeah,
it's a should. Then
no, absolutely
must.
I think the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the paraprofessional staff, which has been mentioned with George Washington and them doing something different. And what is the real role of it? And so I think in this last year, really having conversations about the RAs are for community development, and it's in 7.4 is where it talks about professional development, but what is the true purpose of their role? And I think over time, they deal with more mental health and those types of things, and also enforcing policies. Like right now we have a mask mandate, so they're doing a lot of that. And so how do we get back to the core of it? And I'm not sure if this is a place where we talk a little bit more about, the true role of our student staff. So we can use that as leverage when we're talking to partners at the institution or leaders at the institution about the true essence of what a paraprofessional should be doing. But just a thought.
And I 100% agree with that, coupled with what I said previously, because I think what's happened is their jobs have changed so much and the expectation on them is so high that when we don't then consider how many, whether you have paraprofessional staff or whatever that looks like, but when you don't consider what we're asking them to do against how many students they're supposed to be working with, let alone their own mental health and the things they come to the job with already. So I 100% agree. I think there's some through lines with some of these things that are really important to call out.
Yeah, I had a supervisor said we rely on the least prepared population to handle some of our most challenging situations. And so my task has been given to me to really look at that and look at the position and how we handle and manage things. And so I think if we could speak to that, and maybe there's a different form in which we address this, but that's a concern for me.
So are we talking about a standard where we would implore institutions to make sure that they have essentially right-sized the role of the RA and provided professional resources? Is that what you're talking about? Like, well, like that we don't put too much on the student staff?
Well, I mean, I guess for me, when I think of an RA, it's for community development and engagement and getting to know residents, right? That's the core to me of what they do. And I could be off, but I think they've transitioned from that a great deal to doing some of the more critical things. And so how do we speak to the true nature of what we think the student role should be, knowing that there's other things they'll deal with, but at the core, like I told the Board of Trustees that our RAs are going to focus on community development on the floor, these big, larger things and all this other stuff. The core is built in those relationships.
Yep.
I would add, and maybe this is for a grant note, because I think what, is it Kiana? I'm sorry, and I've met you before, but what she is saying is also, I think this is a big discussion that needs to happen with the institute, with the organization, right? This role of the RA and how are we reimagining it? And why does it look like it did in 1993 when I was an RA? So I think there's value to putting something here, but I also think bigger picture, this deserves a lot of attention, maybe someplace else and some good dialogues, because I would love to get more ideas too. So it may or may not articulate into this document. Maybe it more articulates into our standards, ACUO standards, but I think it's a conversation that really is too late really, right? But COVID has shared with us like, and the problem I see is that CAS, and this kind of reflects on some of the things maybe Larry said, is CAS is a document that our VPs, our presidents know and looking at. And so they're sometimes saying, you need to do this. Have you looked at this? Nope, we don't want you to do a CUHO standards review, but we want you to do CAS. And then so to have so many musts, you just automatically, like even big departments, I'm a medium department, I feel like we're going to fail. And I've said this before at other sessions, like I'm like, well, we'll do our best. And the only addition I was wondering is, and I just scrolled through it, do we see something that talks about feedback loops from students that we're asking? I feel like it's got to be here. I just didn't
It's in
see
the
it.
evaluation section.
Okay.
It talks about it from RHA if you have one, from students in general,
Perfect.
and from student staff.
Okay.
It calls out all three of those as avenues.
Great.
I mean, even, to your point, if you just look at this list of training that we say, I mean, there's no focal point to this thing. And I know, and I think, Grant, is there not a current work group looking at the RA role and through a CUHO-I?
Yeah, there are a couple of task forces that are examining bits and pieces of that for sure. So it's coming out in I think the Return to Work Task Force or Return to Campus Task Force, I think it is, and a little bit in some other places too. So that should be addressed. My guess is down the road, there'll be something a little bit more substantial that focuses in on that, but I don't have information on that right now. But
I wonder, I'm Melissa from University of Illinois. I wonder if there could be, because when I search this document, I do only see resident assistant really appearing one time and then a notation about the student staff members who serve. With the document said being future focused and looking out 8 years, could it sort of be more about looking overall at all of your student staff member positions and how, because there may be people who say, we are hiring these students to do crisis management. We're not calling them RAs. We're hiring these students to do programming. We're hiring, which is somewhat the George Washington model, but they have students who are focused on different aspects. So maybe sort of an overall, what is it, that evaluating your student staff and what are their duties and, what makes sense for them as students, and something along those lines might be a way to go.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I agree, Melissa. I also wonder, I think depending on the institution or the person, would put graduate students in either professional or paraprofessional, which is interesting. And I think as much as graduate student labor is used in housing and residential life programs, I think there needs to be something acknowledging that, or saying like, because I know on some campuses, graduate students are treated like professionals or like students whenever it's convenient or advantageous to the university or the department, which isn't fair. Yes, they're students, but also we treat them like professionals. We need to acknowledge their students. As much as we use grad students, I think there has to be some clarity or acknowledgement of that.
That's helpful.
Should clearly articulate the role of a graduate as a professional and a student, and and
acknowledge the challenge in balancing that or something like that. Yeah. Well, I want to keep us on time for the rest of our day. I really appreciate everybody coming. Grant, if you don't mind, do they have my email address in some way? I guess I could just put it in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead and do that. I can send a follow-up though with that information.
As you think of things, please send them my way. Would love to continue to hear feedback. As you have a chance to continue to think about the conversation we've had here today, as you are able to continue to dig into the document. Again, we've got probably about another month's worth of work on this before we're going to have to put it to bed in order to get it to the CAS Council. But there's going to be significant, still significant rewrites to some of these sections based on this conversation and others. So please don't be afraid to toss stuff our way. You know, if you find something in one of your campus documents that you think really speaks to this and could be, you know, made into a more generalizable standard, you know, if you think of the, you know, that exact right language to describe what you were thinking on this call, please shoot it my way, and I'll make sure that I get it out to the committee. And I just really appreciate everybody coming forward in this, taking time to do this. Bess, all the way from South Africa, appreciate you being here. And just really, I'm glad to have had this time with you.
Thank you very much, everybody from the office. Appreciate that so much. And we'll be in touch shortly. There'll be lots of opportunities to get some feedback on the ACU Hawaii revisions to our standards and core competencies as well. That's a slightly longer process, but we have a large committee working on that. So stay tuned for those updates, and we'll offer some opportunities to engage there too. We'd love that feedback. So thank you, everybody.